Hello everyone, today we talk about Otto I, Western Frankish, Bavarian and Lotharingian campaigns after 944. We have already seen the Lotharingian campaigns of the previous years of Otto's reign, also the ones under his father, Henry the Fowler. We have already observed the distinctive features of Ottonian warfare, not just on the western frontier, but on the eastern one with the Slavs. And outlined, in fact, this main characteristics: lots of sieges, relatively contained cavalry warfare, and a sort of, security measure to avoid, in fact, to engage in major pitched battles when unnecessary, and the reliance fundamentally on all these various net fortified positions. They're typical of the era that sees the most intensive phase of so-called encastellation. Made multiple videos on the topic already, but we'll keep looking at it. And from a strategic point of view, we observed how concretely this was the case for these areas of Central Western Europe. In the previous videos, we observed how the Ottonians had managed fundamentally to affirm what had become the Germanic authority on this sort of in-between failed kingdom, right, that stretched from the North Sea to the Alps, and that had fundamentally not managed to take off as another regional monarchy, like instead, in other river basins like the Danube, the Seine, the Po had, even the Rhone, as a matter of fact, had fundamentally been developing, or at least maintaining, as an institution. You know that essentially until the Sun King, this region would remain under the Holy Roman Empire, and this, at least in part, and there were lots of backs and forths, but to stress, of course, that these lands that in fact are essentially part of today's Germany, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, Luxembourg, were still potentially capable of, say, if not in fact developing the aforementioned kingship on their own, but still constituting a regional reality of sort that, especially in this case under an imperial control, could have been managed. Naturally, the condition of the German monarchy was not as such to allow a high degree of centralization, but the struggle for the control, right, over this, that was from a German perspective, like a Western, of course, frontier, was crucial. There were, as we'll see now, wars that had already been, like with the Western Francia, to wrestle these lands that in some way were also very strategic. A part of it, at least, was significantly developed, and generally speaking, Europe at the time had not already outlined for good the specific, let's say, boundaries that would even approximately exist in essentially a couple of hundred years, right? And so this is where the matter was settled. Also from a military point of view, we observed in the previous videos how Otto had maintained this character, Otto of Verdun, right, in charge of the region of Lotharingia. Otto died in 944, and as a consequence, a Western Frankish army marched into Lotharingia. At the time, the Western Frankish kingdom was undergoing quite some change because of the rise of what would become the Capetians, essentially the Robertian branch of the Counts of Paris. We are at the time the so-called Hugh the Great, who was the father of Hugh Capet, as a matter of fact, that had fundamentally overthrown, or at least usurped, the throne of the young Louis IV. That was incidentally also the brother-in-law of the same Otto I, because he had married the German monarch's sister. So there was a good chance for Otto to interfere in Western Frankish affairs, as much as Duke Capet was trying to consolidate controls further east, considered that Louis had also taken refuge at the Eastern Frankish court, so there were lots of issues in the definition, for example, of the authority on the various, especially archbishoprics that were, as you understand, quite powerful, and especially in these areas where decentralization had produced, albeit a bit as all over post-Carolingian Europe, an enormous rise in the temporal power of bishops, archbishops, that were, as we will see now, true landlords with significant military retinues, and in fact were somehow warrior-minded, and especially in this area north of the Alps. But not only, this was a bit of a characteristic of the time, would go on for centuries. So the Western Frankish invasion of Lotharingia here was not, let's say, done in grand scale. Again, the possibilities of seizing, especially at this time, with a single attack, like the entire region, were pretty dim, right? We're not in, say, late Carolingian times, where these people had essentially already controlled the whole thing, and they could kind of swap it, say, fragmented or remodel them as they wanted. It was a period after, in fact, in the wake of the collapse of the St. Carolingian Empire, that had exhausted a great part of the barely existing public institutions, and that had seen essentially a great reconstruction from the bottom up. So with a lot of private lords that locally were entrenching in their own territory, what essentially the great power of the previously unitary Christina sense of actual command military machine of the Carolingians now were being used to fortify the same heartland locally, and so to create great problems in the territorial recompaction of these kingdoms. This is the dawn of feudal Europe at least in the more proper sense, the 10th century, the rise of the militia, of the essentially what would become the knightly class, and so this militarization of the elites that was already a thing before this time, but that at this point was way more homogeneously spread than before, right? So the king of Eastern Francia, Otto, so to this event that the invasion was halted in its tracks by ordering the mobilization of a large force under what had been up to that point the loyal House of Swabia under the Duke Hermann, that had, as we've seen, provided with significant support to Otto, Henry the Fowler, to avoid that Western Frankish interference could destabilize this area that was just next to them. As we will see now, there would be, as I explained also in the video about Alemannia and Alpine Rhaetia, a revolt that was also guided by the same son of Otto. First, these are all things that I discussed here and there. We'll keep looking a bit more in depth, also thanks to videos like these. But it was, again, about different interests that at some point did overlap, as opposed to just diverging. And military cooperation, especially in the maintenance, what was emerging now as a primacy, an hegemony, and in fact an imperial strength, as it would become in a few years officially, of the Eastern Frankish kingdom intact, right? And losing Lotharingia, that was definitely losing prestige as far as this would have been part of the Middle Francia, right? So this heartland that stretched also across the Alps, right? It should contain Rome as much as Aachen, and so a bit the grandeur of the favored heirs Charlemagne that would have had control of this area was initially the most important of the empire, especially the southern part, so that actually the one north of the Alps was the one remaining a bit more fictitious, right? These lands were in part Neustrian, in part Austrasian, in part also inhabited by other subjects, let's say, of the Franks. So to make things very, very complicated. And definitely, right, imagine, as this would be eventually the dream of the Sun King, etc., the idea of a Western Frankish power managing to secure control up to the Rhine was a thing that would have even overlapped with conceptually with, I don't know, what the Romans had done. I mean, there is an obvious advantage to create these layers of in-depth defense that allow your heartland to be protected from invasions. And this happens, by the way, in a time during the second invasions that were hitting hard the entire post-Carolingian world, which, in my opinion, are, say, overrated in the measure in which they were very often triggered by the same behavior, even the same invitation of the post-Carolingian rulers, right, to play against one another. And still in this time you see how instead the Western and Eastern Frankish kingdom were basically wrestling in this iron arm for still the control of Lotharingia, right, with all the other things that you thought they would have thought about, like they would have to care about. The potential of these monarchies was actually very big, right, and even their fragmentation, especially in the case of Western Francia, it's not much a problem of decay, right? Actually, there is during the 10th century a prepotent development across all post-Carolingian Europe and beyond that would eventually lead to the recompaction of these monarchies, and that, if anything, reflects rather the wealth, the power that existed locally, that allowed all these various lords to just do a bit all what they wanted. Now, as we've seen, the Duke of Swabia, Hermann, had been put at the head of this large force, right, to move west against the Western Franks, in fact, and ensuring the Ottonian control of Lotharingia, which succeeded. Right, essentially, the Western Franks simply said, okay, well, those guys have mobilized enough troops for us not to be able, right, to simply make any significant gain. So the thing somehow stopped at this point. And many of the fortresses that had at that point sided already with the Western Franks now were to be reconquered. Now, this is very interesting because, you see, of all the... This is something I often say when I talk about the Frankrieg, etc. Say, of all the possible, complicacies that one think normally a war is, at this point, what is the point? It's, of course, political will, right? It's moral force. The Ottonians say, okay, we are willing to pay for a large enough force to simply deter the Western Franks from making more headway, and in the process, we're also exploiting the situation because we have mobilized that force so that operationally, strategically, we can use it to put down those various traitors, right, in Lotharingia that, remember, had been brought under, here it's after the death of Otto of Verdun, so that was ruling the region on behalf of Otto I, and that thus had legitimately betrayed, right, royal authority, and as such, committing a crime. And so this was a good excuse to not just reduce them to obedience, but also to gain something from it, say certain strongholds, certain power, simply looting in many ways, reducing this guy's power, that of course meant you being stronger, etc. So of key importance in this context were Otto's orders to Hermann that we know of thanks to, normally here I will be quoting from the annals of Flodoard of Reims, right? There is something from the Res Geste of Widukind of Corbeil. These are essentially the most important sources, as you know, about Ottonian campaigns at this point. With a bit of interpretation, you can really realize what the political and consequently strategic goal really was, because the king of Eastern Francia was telling the Duke of Swabia literally to lay siege to any stronghold in Lotharingia that had abandoned their Dizio to the German king. So Otto's objective was, of course, to control the fortifications of a region, but he was not seeking, this is important, to engage the Western Frankish army that was still there in a battle in open field. We've seen how risky this technically was. You could simply move between a fortress and another, essentially putting the enemy in a difficult position had they tried to besiege a place with relatively stretched resources, so that in order to prevent the fall of the stronghold, you would have had to just approach and obliging him to maybe not threatening in open field. Threatening in open field, but not really giving battle, because with a compact force not scattered all around the stronghold during the siege was the only way for these guys to meet with you and not hoping not to be crushed. And so you could effectively prevent any major achievement there with relatively minimal risk. Right? This was naturally not always possible, but as we've seen, it happened with a certain frequency. Now, in the wake of such difficult situation, by the way, Otto made his Franconian son-in-law, Conrad the Red, I talked about him in the video about medieval Franconia for the Historical Region series, Duke of Lotharingia. As we've seen in the previous videos, this was not the first time that Otto would take so much care of this region to put at its head a trustee, even a relative. The political situation in Lotharingia required military action against various fortifications. This was, again, pretty standard, but it also mirrored the problems further to the west. In 946, after leading a campaign in Burgundy, the king, Otto, who was then commanding, quote, an army composed of diverse peoples, meaning that these levies came from different regions of what was effectively taking the form of an empire, especially from a German perspective, where still, the identity of the various system duchies was very national and somehow distrustful of this centralizing attempt. It was in fact the revolt of the same previously loyal Swabians, in that in the wake of this military success of the Ottonians, that, as you know, were pretty successful from an imperial point of view in general, moved his royal forces into the Western Frankish kingdom. So this army had been mobilized from, as we were saying before, throughout all Otto's regnum, as Flodoard puts it. By the way, Widukind explains that Otto's forces counted 32 legiones, as compared to the 8 mobilized for the Lechfeld campaign of 955, that is much more climatic. So here you can think that this 4 times larger expedition may have not quite been exactly so from a numerical point of view, but that's also a matter of what were those forces integrated like and by whom, which is something we will see more in depth, but especially when we will talk hopefully about the Lechfeld campaign and battle, hopefully soon. In any case, we also observed how these forces were normally put together, right? It was, of course, sort of elite, sort of militas, groups of expeditionary forces, with retinues that were already conceived just to leave for such longer expedition. Then there was the general levy, or still select levy by a degree, that was normally, at least as a whole, compared to the expeditionary forces, habituated to operate much closer range, shorter range. In any case, this big army advanced towards Western Frankland, and you have to understand here that, of course, there was a powerful enemy behind that, so you needed large amount of forces across the Rhine, naturally, and the Meuse rivers. Now, the first objective of Otto was the fortress city of Reims, that, as we've seen, had been the theater of different sieges. Otto lays siege to it. And Reims, in front of this large force, surrenders. Right? It had been surrounded, placed under siege for only 3 days, and this had been enough, albeit being one of the largest centers in Gaul, to not to exist, but to fall, to realize that it would have been useless to put up a fight. Flodoard, that lived there and was within the entourage of the archbishop and his advisors that were in charge of the city's defense, refers that the latter had understood that the Ottonian army was, in fact, sufficiently large that it could take their fortress city by storm. Right, there was usually a proportion of forces, like a superiority of 1 to 4, 1 to 5, in order to storm a city, and still having enough, because it's not just about the 1 to 3 ratio, like of let's say defenders for each attacker, but also the fact that you had to keep this city blockaded, so you needed other forces, mostly the levy ones, all around, building palisades, ditches, etc., to prevent the city to be resupplied. And it was a heavy blow, because Reims eventually will be lost to Western Francia again. But it was still an enormous display of force, right? So Otto moved then his army onto the same Paris, which was also besieged during the summer. This was the most challenging enterprise, definitely. Anyway, prior to this show of force, Otto, just after the surrender of Reims, had moved his forces against the yet another fortress city, a smaller one, but important enough, Senlis, the bishop of which, understand how many bishops were in charge just of the situation locally, the defense of the city, the militias, the city walls, etc., refused to surrender. Right, and the interesting, and this also, this is not just Flodoard, but Adalbert, the continuation of Adalbertus, tells us that Otto was somehow puzzled by this, because there were now 3 options. So Senlis was not as important as Reims, but not, as you understand, even more than Paris. I made a video about medieval Paris, by the way, for still the historical regions series. That city counts like a region, you can argue. Still have to talk about the Ile-de-France. In any case, this was an issue, because, as you know, it's just Senlis was in this case on the path to Paris, so there was always the risk that the garrison could carry out a sortie if left behind along the march, could threaten the supply lines of the Ottonians, the usual thing. So Otto could besiege the city, and to even starve the defenders into submission, because he had a much larger force. I mean, he had taken Reims, Senlis would have fallen. But again, politically and strategically, you can make a lot of damage if you make such big army besieging you, and you can be a hero and sacrificing yourself, paying the consequences, but still doing much to the cause of the broader cause, and such siege to Senlis would require, especially a significant amount of time, because it was difficult to storm it just per se, right? This was an option. He could have stormed the city, right? The other option was simply to bypass Senlis with all the implication of the case. Of course, it's either time or men or supplies that you are spending here. And as you see here, there's no alternative. This is how war in reality really is. If you pick from somewhere, you have to take away from the other, and naturally you have to understand which one is likely to provide you with better outcome in the process. So Otto decided, also was a guy who definitely had some military vision, decided that Senlis, and this is how he put it, was not worth taking by storm with the slaughter of his own men. Right, accordingly, he chose to pass by this stronghold and to continue his campaign towards Paris, that, as we've seen, was reached. The campaign against Reims and Senlis, despite the different outcomes, shows, by the way, how all these proceedings didn't entail much of mounted combat in the first place. Surely cavalry was employed even during siege warfare, because all these cities were not perfectly fortified, and or when a breach was open, and or some places could still be stormed, and even horses could be in fact introduced in the city streets. Like you could definitely, and you would fight on horseback, of course, but the general notion that at this time cavalry was already that somehow univocal type of sort of arm, for winning engagements in a general way, was not quite completely there, right? We always remember that cavalry would truly dominate European battlefields from, say, the mid-12th century to the beginning of the 14th, right? Then, at this point, it was already the prevalent arm. Don't get me wrong. Actually, I'm a great, supporter of the idea that cavalry was much more developed, especially probably in equestrian capacities from the side of the horsemen than we usually think, right? People say the Anglo-Saxons didn't have cavalry, or the Vikings had scarce cavalry. That's not really correct, right? It's correct to say that they didn't have such a collectively trained amount of good and sort of large numbers of cavalry. That's true. And when you look at even the heartland here of most equestrian development occurring in Central Europe, like these cultures here in the Frankish world that had definitely been boosting mounted combat further in a dramatic way across its history, you still see, first of all, still a relatively gradual development of this. But also the fact that, operationally speaking and tactically, you wouldn't have much chances even to engage in open field. Here we're looking just in this video is just at sieges fundamentally. Maneuvering, counter-maneuvering, but hardly ever any major engagement did happen anyhow, and they would happen sometimes even in a sort of blitz fashion, right? We have seen it, for example, in the previous video, looking at the Lotharingian rebels being crushed while crossing a river, and even just cavalry apparently is the most mobile forces of the Ottonians, just attacking them in that extremely delicate operation that, as you know, is very risky, because it puts the enemy in a condition of weakness, not deployed, not having the capacity to maneuver, to form a front, etc. So these warriors were, at least in the elite, especially the militaires, were incredible horsemen, right? But in this environment, the capacity to actually fight on a regular basis in major cavalry engagements with, say, hundreds of or even thousands of horsemen in an open field, were practically non-existent, or at least they existed, but on a much smaller scale. Normally, then of course major engagements could take place. I mean, we mentioned the Lechfeld before, and those were those kind of battles where you could really see something at work against also other hell of equestrian military cultures, like the Magyar one in that case. But even this apparently much larger army, according to the sources, it was sent to invade a major regional power like the Western Frankish one. Here is simply just moving by the sheer weight of numbers. Here, as you've seen it, with the previous Western Frankish invasion, the Duke Hermann was simply instructed to take over fortifications, not engaging in open field with the enemy. So this naturally does affect the way these armies were also levied, conceived, and so sometimes it's just a number here, especially for overcoming fortresses, for blockading them, storming them, that really makes most of the strategic deal, because in fact, if you didn't capture these larger centers, they could be really a thorn in the side, not to say worse. So even here, the decision to consider Senlis as somehow negligible in the picture, after having taken Reims, because you're going towards Paris, well, in perspective, it does make sense, but it's also a testament to the large size of the Teutonic army could, in a sense, afford to even intimidate the garrison of Senlis to fundamentally desist from being too much of a threat to Teutonian supply lines. And this is not to say, naturally, that such attacks from the rear wouldn't happen. As a matter of fact, there would be lots of these smaller engagements, guerrilla ambushes, stuff like that. It's just that they wouldn't be recorded in the annals of military history, because in fact the sources here are just concentrating on the bigger picture. But imagine having an entire era, right, in the history of warfare where by default that there were plenty of other engagements. It's just, you observe that they're not documented, and so you have to make the effort comparatively with all the precautions of the case with other eras to understand here what was concretely happening, and always remembering that the primary deal here was political, right? It was about those who could support this invasions, this changes in balance, right? And so you couldn't even quite clearly see who was who at a point, because these areas were also relatively similar, right? As we've seen, even just from a military point of view, there wasn't essentially a difference, if not a very loose one. And in any case, it was moral force primarily that dictated, even in spite of saying, you can say, yes, for example, the Eastern Franks had less cavalry than the Western ones, right? But how relevant was this overall, right? It was the Germans who recreated the empire at this point, and this, of course, is a political issue, a moral one as well. And as we've seen here, it's just about the masses that you can mobilize that sometimes actually make that sort of difference, and that depends not on a merely material issue. On the contrary, it's a prevalently moral one that starts also from the motivations. Why would you decide to go to war? Because when you summon your vassals, etc., it was normal for a part of them not to show up, and that was a problem, right? We'll see better this in other videos about the organization of these armies more specifically. So 2 years after aiding his brother-in-law Louis IV of Western Francia, that was essentially raised in England, so he just spoke Old English rather than French. He didn't know much. His realm, when he came back from exile from Britain, and was, in this sense, used a bit as a puppet initially by Hugh the Great. King Otto again ordered Duke Conrad, Conrad the Red, Conrad of Franconia, that, as we've seen, was put at the head of Lotharingia, to mobilize the army, the exercitus specifically, of Lotharingia to aid the Western Frankish king in 948. Here we're not even focusing, as you understood from the siege of Paris, even on the outcome of the operations, etc. We're looking specifically at how these armies used to act and on which political mandate, which gets down also to the organization, the composition. Now, this Lotharingian mobilization against the Western Franks is also remarkable, because again, this is like a huge chunk, right, of forces that you could just use to infest the Western neighbors, right? It was more complicated to operate in Germany overall. It was much easier at this point to have this basis in Lotharingia and to move towards the west. Doesn't matter how this also more courageous could appear, like more fortified, more developed historically than Eastern Friendship, but still, as you see here, unstable, with Louis IV, that is the legitimate ruler. He was the son of Charles the Simple. He was essentially Carolingian. Essentially what would become the Carpathians were instead here taking control in their stead. There were lots of issues going on. Now, a prominent part of this Lotharingian army, which took 4 weeks to mobilize, a month, was composed of the usual mix of expeditionary troops and levies. The most important aspect, however, among the former is the presence of Lotharingian prelates, Archbishop Robert of Trier, Bishop Raoul II of Laon, and Bishop Adalbero of Metz. Right, these were practically some of the most important centers of Lotharingian, especially in the areas that were more directly controlled, because some, as we've seen, for example, in Dutch history, etc., were somehow more decentralized. There were these expeditions to bring them down as well, but first of all, the most important lands were the southern ones, and at the time they were more developed, etc., and they were just the most direct bridge towards the Ile-de-France, the Western Frankish heartland, as it was basically consolidating around the local monarchy. Now, the aforementioned bishops possessed vast landed wealth. Therefore, they were responsible for mobilizing large numbers of expeditionary forces. This had always been the case. Like in Carolingian armies, I made a video, I think, about Carolingian armies organization, but we still have to talk a lot, and especially about this topic. I mean, the one of ecclesiastical forces, right? Bishops were asked to at least lead properly their forces in person to the war zone, let's say. At that point they could leave, but many of them would stay to fight, also because they were aside from the fact that here we're far from the Gregorian reforms, there is all a very secular lifestyle of these individuals that is virtually identical to the one of the lay lords. But you have naturally, as a consequence, the deep political interest in participation in such expeditions for what could come from such campaigns to the prelates, right? And we're talking about, again, large, vast clienteles of very... I made a video about probably 10th, 11th century Lotharingian ministeriales that explains a bit what these areas were developing exactly because of the power of ecclesiastical forces in the absence of a strong lay power, at least probably on a Lotharingian basis. Here the Ottonians control the land, but it's still done so in a relatively decentralized way, and again there is no such thing like the king of Lotharingia or anything like that. You have these appointees, as you have seen with Conrad the Red, Franconian nobility sent there by by the Ottonians because they were married into them. But the true lords of these big cities are, as we've seen also for Reims, by the way, before, prelates, right? The bishops. At this point, Robert and his colleagues, Robert of Trier, in fact, the bishop of this area, of the former Belgian province, led their forces to besiege and subsequently to threaten to storm the castrum of Mouzon. Right, it had an important strategic location on the area. It would require a significant concentration of forces. The commander of this stronghold recognized that the enemy forces were so large, however, that there was not much of a chance to withstand their assault. So he preferred to avoid bloodshed and surrender straight away. As the chronicler in question here is still Flodoard, points out, Mouzon surrendered because it was, in fact, indeed faced by an overwhelming force. So this was recognized explicitly by the source that says, there was not much that could be done against such powerful contingents. So that such episcopal forces would only then joined the rest of the Lotharingian exercitus that at that point had remained detached, right? So this was, this shows the autonomy of the ecclesiastical forces compared to the lay levy, right, of freemen, like the exercitus, as we've seen, was in theory everybody, all the able-bodied freemen, plus, yes, there were some serfs, that could be mobilized, and of course this was not just the whole levy, it was just a section of the freemen, but still it meant the mobilization of the entire region in line of principle. The bishops had by themselves like sort of mini armies that were all very complete, and so administered, as you know, through all the privileges and immunities that the church had in a very autonomous way, but still very updated and one, because the ecclesiastical principalities were much more centralized than basically anything that existed in the lay world, given that first of all they didn't have to split any inheritance. Like once a bishop died, he would elect another one, and the ecclesiastical community there would remain the same. They were centered in the cities, as you understand here, also Roman, Gallo-Roman foundation. With an important urban tradition historically, in spite of the decadence occurred during the early Middle Ages, of course. In any case, such united forces like the episcopal one plus the Lotharingian army laid siege to yet another stronghold, the one of Montagu, which fell quickly. As well as not huge strongholds, but they were significant, and again, such overwhelming force meant really, from a strategical point of view, wanted to seize this the centers for good, just to expand the amount of fortifications could be eventually manned, maintained over time, etc. In 952, the Lotharingians are called again to besiege an enemy fortification, what is called in the sources the munitio, literally the ammo, meaning actually what was the Roman version of what we call the limes, the munimentum, right? So something that is provided with substantial protection of Marouille. Flodoard tells us specifically that the Lotharingian force besieging Marouille constructed, quote, many machines, in Latin multe machine, which is the frustratingly standard for every medieval military historian to know term for telling us just sort of siege machinery of any kind. It could be just some sort of simple protections like palisades, etc., or literal catapults, right, to attack this stronghold. Flodoard also notes that the Lotharingian force suffered remarkable losses before being able to take Marouille, which in fact would habitually happen, but naturally one stronghold could be, say, nastier than another in its resistance. The defense of Marouille is interesting also for the fact that to defend the stronghold we find fundamentally local levies. Of course there were some militias of some sort, but the idea, of course, it was normal also for a fortification besieged by likely artillery of some sort would, of course, have to be coped with on a regular basis. So you find maybe that this is the question: why does in this in this account the information that machines are employed? In this case, you notice that it says multe macchine. So the reason why it was said is that not that it was strange to have machines, but in this case they were say present in larger number than the usual. But otherwise it would be completely normal, because I don't know a single siege in which some kind of machinery would be employed. Right? And we will talk about early and high medieval artillery as well, because we somehow overlook how already quite technical. I mean, even Vikings attacking Paris had catapults of some sort. So you can't just imagine in Central Europe that had much greater amounts of means and general political and military structures already well developed from in a substantial way. There can be also an interesting observation about the revolt of 953 against Otto in Germany. This included Duke Conrad as one of the leaders. Once again, it provides a glimpse into the unavoidable importance of siege warfare in this western frontier of the eastern Frankish realm. So Otto initially responds to the rebels, with Conrad taking refuge as a consequence in the fortress city of Mainz. So we are in German proper, well, on the right bank of the Rhine, which became, understandably, from there on, Otto's main objective. But before taking Mainz, of course, you needed to secure the area around, so that many fortifications in Lotharingia, so further west, that had been loyal and were being loyal to Conrad, had to be taken down, captured. This is what Otto does first, right? So in this context, we have the successful siege of Breisach that had already been, as we've seen, stormed years before. Otto then moved his main force to Mainz, finally, with a substantial artillery train, this multe macchine that recurs again, and that are witnessed by different sources, by the way, so that this was, of course, important. Mainz was also, because one of the largest cities in Germany. It belonged to the Romanized infrastructural limes. In fact, there was a quite important center that required a great logistical effort to be besieged. So much so that Otto does so for 2 months, right? And during the siege of Mainz, the king learned that the fortress city of Regensburg on the Danube, that was a bit the capital, we can argue, of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, or at least it had been so, the most important one, the one that opened to the east, right, to the south as well, from the Bavarian position, had also revolted in support of his son Ludolf. This was a major issue. Again, we will see this revolt again better on another occasion, but we're talking about major centers that were at this point essentially resisting as the consequence of Otto's strength and political as military affirmation, right? So the main result would occur in Germany 2 years later, because the Magyars finally were more of a problem than the same Eastern Frankish monarchy. Then there is the Italian expedition and all this stuff, but this tail strike, let's say, of rebellions that in Germany, of course, would continue regularly throughout medieval history against constituted power, are still dangerous at that point, right? The Magyar threat had not been extinguished yet. Saxony, Thuringia, the same Bavaria actually were endangered by the Hungars, and in a structural sense, right? This country had been established as a kingdom from Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony, at least had brought to the completion of the conquest of Germany, a feat that not even the Romans had succeeded in completing. And as we've seen, the Ottonians represent a bit the best of this Romano-Germanic Catholic imperial success, there's a reason why eventually was this dynasty to celebrate the Holy Roman Imperial Renovatio, right? But it did come at a cost of these local resistances, of the fact that, of course, now we are in a deeply aristocratized world, very different from the time of the Carolingian conquest, but still one that worked on the base of stem duchies that were at this point able to hijack, let's say, the same son of Otto in this case, to say make him stay in power locally. And this is how it normally works. It's as if these guys became a bit local when they came to rule on this, that were considered in Germany properly as different countries. Like the stem duchies were separated by large forests, where still Germany was covered in swamps. It hadn't been colonized, but just think about what it could be literally in the 10th century. And it was also, this explains the aforementioned and also the persistent use of infantry forces or dismounted knights throughout a very, very well late in time, till the mid-12th century, before French feudalism kicked in under Frederick Barbarossa by imitation full, and the German national monarchy could start trying to make things work properly. A terrain, right, that wouldn't facilitate the use of cavalry on a regular basis, and again, especially in sieges, but not only. In autumn of 953, Otto leads a column to Bavaria because he lacked sufficient numbers of troops. In fact, Widukind of Corbeil says explicitly that the king departed cum paucis, that is to say, with a few troops intended, and also lacked a siege terrain. This campaign came to now, right? Widukind is quite clear about this. This was a problem because, as we've seen, say, winter campaigning did exist, as a matter of fact. Think about the Carolingian, the harshest Carolingian fort in Saxony herself, right? But such large forces, everything was better done during the season, so that the following spring, Otto again invaded Bavaria, right? On this occasion with a large army and a substantial siege terrain. So in his way south to the Danube, Otto besieges the powerful fortress of Rostal, right, that is located 20 kilometers south of Nuremberg, that was held by the Count of Hammerstein, that was Ludolf's ally. Widukind describes the assault on the fortress. There are some interesting questions regarding the identity of the defender, the garrison there, because these fights were ferocious, even in terms of personal involvement of the leaders. Right, these were all warriors. Right, it was a time in which you would fight even as the leader of such powerful realms. Very often on the front, on the forefront, you had to be, in fact, the better of everyone, and politically this still counted enormously, right, to decide who was the strongest. Think about how, the poor Charles the Fat was deserted by everyone as soon as voices spread at his court that Arnulf of Carinthia had challenged him, that had been emerging as a leader. These people were all infatuated deeply with the concept of properly the equivalent of the empire, right, in their in the traditional sense. So everything was thought to be about this, right, even personal honor, etc. And the best way to prove this was, in theory, self-sacrifice in holy war, which was basically the only purpose of any traditional culture. So this, speaking of Rostal specifically, this stronghold had been built by the same Charlemagne around the year 800. It was built on a plateau west of the Ratnitz River and enclosed an area of some 5 hectares. In the year 953, it was also protected by a blended wall, which we know comprised a mortared stone surface, approximately 2 meters thick, right, fronting an earthen and timber wall, 7 meters in width. So this is, again, given the times and places, a substantial structure, to say the least. The wall was protected by 5 meters and a half berm, 2 ditches, right. The inner ditch was 15 meters wide and 3 meters and a half deep, right. A tough nut to crack, to say the least. Not wishing to waste any time in his pursuit of his son, Ludolf, Otto decides again to invest the fortress and beginning what might be a lengthy siege. Instead, he orders an assault on the walls that lasted all day long. According to Widukind, both sides suffered heavy losses, right? But when the night fell, the defenders still held out, remarkably enough. This tells you how, even the strongly they could resist to the full brunt of a hell of an army like the one that the king had mobilized, and that was meant, in fact, to overwhelm. It was fresh. It was had been sent fully supplied with the adequate artillery, etc. Right. So, considering this indecisive action at Rostal, Otto, that was still to reach Regensburg as the main objective, decided to move on his main target. So in other words, he bypassed, like Senlis before, right, Rostal, which was a risk, naturally, but Regensburg was more important. Regensburg is reached, is put under siege. So there was also here a substantial defense that saw some tactical ingenuity as well. For example, among the defenders, there was a force of mounted troops that was likely made up by the obsequia, that is the retinues of the local magnates, right? And such forces sallied forth from the city in a ruse to draw Otto's troops from their fortified camp. In the meanwhile, a shipborne force was dispatched to attack the Ottonian camp through an amphibious assault from the Danube. Right? So a real ruse, right, to distract the enemy and essentially having him surprised by some flank or rear attack. Anyhow, Otto had maintained a unit of mounted troops as a reserve himself, so in the event that the besieged troops should attempt such a trick. And the result was that the Ottonian cavalry drove the Bavarian contingent back into Regensburg. This tells you, again, how well organized, prepared Otto's force was, how much insight and experience the king really had. Like, Otto spent his life on horseback, so he knew his deal. Such situation tells you finally about the potential of cavalry, even during the course of a siege, even though this was not technically a siege operation, at least in a tactical sense. The following year, 954, Regensburg revolted again. So again, Otto besieges the city. This was, again, remember the rivalry between northern and southern Germany would remain very bitter because of the very different nature of the regions historically, but it was about the Saxon north that was managing to, from his more primitive, sturdy, warlike culture, to impose himself on the centers that had made the grandeur of the Frankish Empire, right? So these efforts are so bloody because there's at stake literally the control over the entire Eastern Frankish kingdom, right? Again, centralization wouldn't be a thing in a medieval perspective in this land, but still the hegemonic capacity of essentially forcing the various stem duchies to obedience and cooperation that was fruitful in part also for them, did entail, of course, a monarchic preeminence that also asked, of course, something in exchange. It was becoming very powerful, very volatile, right? During the siege of Regensburg of 954, we know that Otto had a large siege train, quote, armis machinisque, as Widukind puts it, which cowed the rebels who hurried to treat with the king for the surrender to St. Regensburg. So these operations had been quite hammeringly effective, and the Saxons were good at that, evidently. Now, during the late 50s of the 10th century, the Archbishop Bruno, that was Otto's younger brother, who had been appointed Duke of Lotharingia in 953, continued to follow this traditional strategy that dated back essentially to Carolingian times in using the Lotharingian expeditionary force on the western frontier of the Dutch, just to reinforce the boundaries with the Western Franks. Bruno's initial military operations were undertaken against what were called adulterine fortifications, which is a term used by the sources here to point out again this dramatic proliferation of castles that was occurring, of course, in a way that could be hardly prevented in a significant fashion by the king, the emperor by that point, and that were of course built by the local magnates that established essentially the banal lordships, the de facto rule of the local communities without being dislodged and without having. You remember this in the Frankish mentality, the entire kingdom belonged to the king. in theory, like a private possession. So you couldn't quite simply erect a castle or exact tolls or doing, essentially taking over public prerogatives without the permission of the public authority, the highest one. So these fortifications had eventually been built within Lotharingia, because it doesn't matter how overall this land would fall into the sphere of control of the Germans. Still, like in the same Germany, in many fringes, but not even. Sometimes in most powerful stem duchies, you could simply have nobles doing what they wanted, and there was a great sense of this. I made a video about the same Lotharingia at the time, Frederick Barbarossa, and Swabia in comparison, and that tells you a lot about how what they called the honor of the duchy was considered like by the local nobility, even in times in which literally the same emperor was from that very duchy, right? They could still dictate some conditions, because it was considered like just a tradition, an ethnic thing of that people, and at that point read that nobility, because that's basically what it had been from quite a long time now. And that, in fact, even these, speaking of the 10th century, this encapsulation had fundamentally proven, because as we explained in the videos about medieval society, this phenomenon was accompanied by a fundamental loss of control, right, of this public prerogatives and defense during the time of second invasions. And all these wars, as you understand, were quite intense, right? It wasn't just Vikings, Magyars, and Saracens pouring in from out. It was mostly about the continental Europeans fighting among each other, right? And considering even those external threats not this enormous deal, because objectively they weren't, right? If not in some peripheral situation, was also generally speaking a weaker one just per se. And so the idea that the nobility, and that's how in fact the military class was established. The milites emerged because these are the few guys that are under a senior, a lord, someone who can pay for them for being professional military and essentially controlling the district. This is not to say that the peasantry wasn't strong still at this point. Actually, they would be much stronger this time than in the 14th century, or even in the modern age for that matter. People think that magically people they had more relative liberty. That's not quite the case. The peasantry throughout most of the Middle Ages was one of the single most radically brutal, traumatic, and violent forces that were out there, right? Except they didn't have much of a head, so they tended to lose it and to be put down when they tried the big thing. But at this point, the trend definitely in these areas was mostly the one of the subjection to the local lords, and so the establishment of very deep certification. I mean, especially in Germany, but also think about France. I mean, there was no such thing. There wasn't space for much liberties, not even by other communities, right? Even if you were a commune or a village, whatever you say, outside of your space, there was a prince, a bishop, another lay nobleman who dictated rule, and there was not much room for expansion beyond that, right? This is the norm, at least, say, for the continental European average, as much as most of European average. There are very few exceptions to this, but also quite significant ones. In practice, these adulterine fortifications, that they had not received the royal licencia, so the license, as in fact Flodoard of Reims says explicitly, right? So Bruno was tasked with the destruction of such castles, right, on behalf of his brother, right? It was the guy who had to confer such permissions for building fortifications, which it's quite serious as a concept. It's as if, again, the mob starts building a fortress within a sovereign, say, state, ideally, and the means at disposal of the state are the same ones, say, a bit more advanced ones that the mob has, but still providing with all these troubles. And you know how, in fact, German history would evolve historically with a further fragmentation, actually. So in 960, Bruno also leads his Lotharingian exercitus against the fortresses of Schwerpunkt and Namur. The latter, have quite a strategic relevance throughout all military history. And in the same 960, Bruno also leads the Lotharingian levies to Burgundy, laying siege to Troyes in Champagne as well. So quite an intense activity. In the same year, again, Bruno besieged Troyes, again in also Dijon. So all important forces, by the way, that show how robust Lotharingian forces concretely were, just even to operate through their local organization, but at the command of a single individual sent there by the emperor, right? However, while Bruno was besieging Dijon, there was a revolt at Schwerpunkt. So again, this shows the limits, right, of all this. I don't know, that there is that game with the mole that you have to smash its head with the hammer, and they pop out of the, of the whole various holes, and that's a bit like the same thing here. It is true that these royal forces, the imperial forces, are quite effective, even in a decentralized position on a local basis, but still, concerning the latter, you have lots of different castles that just can switch, say, can pass to a rebel. There are others that are being built, so things start being complicated for sure. Bruno reacts, by the way, abandoning the siege of Dijon, was a much larger city than the stronghold of Schwerpunkt, to besiege the latter, where he was at least successful, but in that case, again, it was sufficient to abandon the siege of a much bigger city like Dijon. That would have surely brought great benefit to the Ottonian cause had it been taken at that point. You see here there is intervention in Burgundy, etc. This is the moment in which the Ottonian Empire was expanding also far beyond Germany, and so there is an erosion of the Western Frankish kingdom, because as powerful as the Robertians could be in the north, in Paris, etc., still the areas just immediately south, southeast were very often out of the reach of their action, because, by the way, there were a lot, but we will see Western Frankish military history at this point. There was a lot going on, say, even in Normandy and in other places, with all this sort of succession, say, power struggles in general that naturally couldn't make these armies intervene everywhere, and especially in areas that were somehow less relevant but still important right now. So these are the political problems and limits that you can appreciate. And so when you look at the military instrument of politics, you can soundly appreciate the rationale behind this forces organization and employment, so that everything here appears essentially coherently, and consider that we have a very few information about the actual situation. Here we have just a chronicler telling us the story in a relatively simple way. You can read all the sources in the MGH, but that's basically all we have, right? There is not a further step in in this history by saying, oh, well, there is so much still that we haven't quite seen. Yes, in a comprehensive way, yes, perhaps. In a systemic way, but not in the sense that you will find magically other information about these times and places. Essentially what we have here is all we know. And it better we can extend this on augmenting the amount of things you know individually so that you can see things better and in a clearer way, but we have to stay humble to realize that unfortunately whatever happened in every situation in the past is in part lost, right? And there is nothing we can do about it, unfortunately. In any case, this is the picture. We will in part look at the various I don't know which aspects to continue in, because especially about Ottonian warfare, that is very fascinating, even though, as you understand here, nothing was really innovative or different, again, etc. But the military history per se, all of it, and again, the political implications are very important. We still haven't done much, right? So these videos are a bit an introduction to that. We can talk a bit more about the actual organization, the structure of the fortresses. These things are also important because they give you a sort of physical, concrete idea of the bulwarks of the difficulties that existed at the time. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.